Half of Americans believe their country has already lost global influence. Not enemies of America saying that, Americans themselves, and two-thirds of them think China is now equally powerful or stronger than the United States. That data dropped in January 2026 from the Carnegie Endowment. Now ask yourself, if the country that built the entire post-war financial order can no longer convince its own citizens it is winning, what exactly is holding that order together? The answer is almost nothing, and the unraveling is happening faster than anyone in power wants to admit. Let's talk about what actually broke and when. For 80 years, the world ran on a single operating system. America was the administrator. The dollar was the password. If you wanted to trade oil, you needed dollars. If you wanted access to global capital markets, you needed to follow Washington's rules. If you stepped out of line, you got sanctioned. If sanctions didn't work, you got a military intervention. The system was enforced not by law, but by overwhelming force, economic, financial, and military. And for decades, it worked perfectly. Every country on Earth was essentially paying a silent tax to America just by holding dollars in reserve and buying US Treasury bonds. Here is what nobody told you about that system. It had a fatal design flaw built in from the beginning. To keep the world supplied with dollars, America had to run permanent trade deficits. It had to buy more than it sold. It had to consume more than it produced. And to make that work economically, it exported its manufacturing base. Factories moved to China, supply chains moved to Southeast Asia, and an entire generation of American workers in the industrial heartland watched their livelihoods disappear. The elites in New York and Washington called it globalization and told everyone it was progress. What it actually was a slow-motion transfer of industrial power from the United States to China, funded entirely by American consumers buying cheap goods on credit. By 2026, China manufactures more steel, more ships, more solar panels, more electric vehicles, and more semiconductors than any other country on Earth. The country that was supposed to be a cheap labor workshop became the world's factory, then the world's engineer, and is now becoming the world's banker. Meanwhile, America's share of global GDP has been shrinking for 2 decades. The country that once represented 40% of global economic output now sits closer to 24%. That is not a minor fluctuation. That is a structural shift that does not reverse. Write in the comments. Do you think the United States can rebuild its manufacturing base fast enough to reverse this trend? I want to know what you think. Now let's talk about the people who actually run the global financial system, because it is not governments, it is not presidents. The real power sits with asset managers. 4 institutions: BlackRock, Vanguard, JP Morgan, and State Street, manage combined assets that exceed the GDP of Germany and Japan combined. And understand what that actually means in practice. These are not just passive investors sitting on piles of money, because every major corporation needs capital and goes public to access it. A significant share of every publicly traded company ends up inside index funds and institutional portfolios. The asset managers hold the voting rights. They appoint board members. They shape corporate strategy. They approve or block mergers and acquisitions. Larry Fink, the chairman of BlackRock, has been saying the same thing for years now. The future is tokenization. Move every asset class, stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities, onto a blockchain where it can trade instantly, globally, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without borders, without friction, without intermediaries. Why? Because whoever controls the infrastructure that money flows through has more real power than any government. They don't need an army, they don't need elections, they already own shares in every company that matters. Below that layer sit the banks, and right now, banks are terrified. The head of the French central bank, François Villeroy de Galhau, stood up at Davos in January 2026 and said explicitly that the privatization of money is the single greatest threat to financial stability. Translation: banks are afraid of becoming obsolete. They're afraid that stablecoins, crypto wallets, and tokenized assets will rout around them entirely. Brian Armstrong, CEO of Coinbase, said it directly. Americans should be able to earn more on their money. Banks need to compete on equal terms. If a stablecoin offers 10% annually and a savings account offers 2%, people will move their money. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is basic arithmetic. And for the banking system, it is an existential threat. But here is what the financial war between asset managers, banks, and crypto actually means for the average person watching this. It means the financial system you grew up with, the one where you keep money in a bank, earn almost nothing on it, pay fees to access your own savings, and wait 3 days for a wire transfer to clear. That system is dying. It will not die tomorrow. But the infrastructure being built right now in real time is being built to replace it, and the people building it are not doing it for your benefit. They are doing it because control over digital financial infrastructure is the most valuable thing in the world in 2026. Now, let's zoom out and look at the geopolitical map, because the financial collapse of American dominance does not happen in isolation. It happens alongside the breakdown of every other pillar that held the old order in place. Germany's Friedrich Merz stood at Davos 2026 and told the room that the old world order is unraveling at a dizzying pace. He used those exact words. Dizzying pace. This is not a radical politician on the fringe. This is the leader of Europe's largest economy speaking to the most powerful collection of financial and political leaders on the planet. And he said the quiet part out loud. The era of American-led rules-based order is ending, and Europe is not ready for what comes next. Europe's problem is structural and severe. For decades, Europe outsourced its energy security to Russia and its military security to America. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Europe discovered that its entire energy infrastructure was built on a dependency it could not quickly escape. When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, Europe discovered that its military security guarantee was conditional on political alignment with Washington, and that alignment could evaporate overnight. Europe spent 70 years building a comfortable social model on the assumption that someone else would handle the hard problems. Now, those problems have arrived, and Europe is scrambling to respond with institutions and budgets that were designed for a completely different world. The Davos 2026 Geopolitics Report from the World Economic Forum put it bluntly. Geopolitics took center stage like never before. The conversation was no longer about how to make globalization work better. It was about how to manage its collapse and who gets to write the rules of whatever comes next. Middle powers, India, Turkey, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, are no longer waiting for permission from Washington or Brussels to act in their own interests. They're cutting deals with whoever offers the best terms. They are buying Russian oil at discounted prices. They are joining Chinese-led infrastructure projects. They are settling bilateral trade in currencies that are not the dollar, and none of them are apologizing for it. This brings us to the dollar itself. The Hoover Institution published a model in January 2026 showing that if demand for dollar-denominated safe assets continues declining at its current trajectory, the real value of the dollar falls by 7.6% and U.S. long-term interest rates rise by nearly a full percentage point. That sounds like a technical footnote. It is not. A 1% rise in U.S. long-term interest rates adds hundreds of billions of dollars annually to the cost of servicing America's national debt, which has already crossed $36 trillion. Morgan Stanley's analysis from late 2025 confirmed the dollar depreciation trend is structural, not merely cyclical. Japan is selling U.S. treasuries to defend the yen. China has been systematically reducing its treasury holdings for 3 years. The recycling mechanism that kept dollar demand artificially elevated, where countries earn dollars through trade, then park those dollars in U.S. government bonds, is unwinding. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this conversation has spread. Here is the deeper story that the headlines miss. What is really dying is not just the dollar's reserve currency status. What is dying is the enforcement mechanism that made the whole system work. The petrodollar system worked because America could credibly threaten military or economic consequences for anyone who stepped outside it. Sanctions against Iran, against Russia, against Venezuela, against North Korea. The message was always the same. Play by our rules or get locked out of the global economy. But each time that weapon was used, it accelerated the search for alternatives. Russia and China began settling bilateral trade in rubles and yuan years before the Ukraine sanctions. The BRICS bloc, which added 6 new members, including Saudi Arabia in 2024, represents over 40% of global GDP and is actively building payment infrastructure that bypasses SWIFT and the dollar entirely. The enforcement mechanism is breaking down because the thing being enforced against has become too large, too interconnected, and too determined to be isolated. And then came something that almost nobody in Western media analyzed properly. Trump's return to power in January 2025 did not stabilize the American-led order. It accelerated its fragmentation by withdrawing from multilateral institutions, renegotiating security arrangements, and applying tariff pressure on allies and adversaries alike. The Trump administration signaled that the old deal, America provides security and market access, you follow our rules, was being rewritten unilaterally. Allies who spent decades betting their security on that deal are now hedging, and adversaries who spent decades being contained by that deal are now pushing harder than ever because they understand that the window of American distraction may not stay open forever. The Stimson Center's Global Risk Assessment for 2026 identified the fragmentation of the rules-based international order as the single most consequential systemic risk of the year. Not climate change, not AI, not pandemic. The collapse of the institutional architecture that has prevented great power conflict since 1945. That is what analysts who study these things professionally believe is the most dangerous thing happening right now. Tell me what you think in the comments. Is America's loss of global dominance good or bad for the rest of the world? Write your answer. This question matters. Now let's talk about the 4 power groups that are negotiating what comes next, because understanding them is the difference between being confused by the news and actually understanding it. The financial industrial complex, the asset managers, investment banks, and central banks wants a world where capital remains liquid, mobile, and manageable. Even as nations fragment and borders harden, they need money to flow freely. Their solution is digitization and tokenization of everything. Put every asset on a blockchain, fraction it into microshares, let it trade instantly across any border. The person who controls that infrastructure does not need to control armies or parliaments. They control something more fundamental: the pipes through which all economic activity flows. Sovereign leaders of nuclear-armed states want the opposite. They want hard borders, domestic control of energy, food, industry, and defense. They are willing to sacrifice market efficiency for strategic autonomy. They do not need the approval of BlackRock or the IMF. They have natural resources, nuclear deterrence, and populations willing to accept short-term economic pain in exchange for independence. This is why the financial establishment despises them. They're unpredictable. They are, from the perspective of pure capital, inefficient. But their populations keep supporting them because people prefer order and sovereignty to integration and dependence on systems they do not control and do not understand. Technocrats sit in the middle of this power struggle and genuinely do not care who wins. They need government contracts, data access, and permission to operate. They will build digital identity systems, social scoring infrastructure, automated surveillance, and AI-managed resource allocation for whoever pays. The collapse of the old order does not threaten them. It actually strengthens them. Because in a fragmented, unstable world, both sovereign leaders and financial powers need the systems only technocrats can build. This is why investment in AI, robotics, and digital infrastructure is accelerating even as the geopolitical situation deteriorates. Technology is the one asset class that benefits from chaos. The military-industrial complex is the enforcement layer. It does not serve governments directly. It serves whoever controls the financial flows, because financial power dominates governments, not the other way around. But here is the uncomfortable truth about where this is heading. The old model of military enforcement, invade, sanction, threaten, contain, is losing its effectiveness precisely because the economic and geopolitical blocks being targeted have grown too large to be isolated. A new model is emerging. Not fewer conflicts, but different ones. Proxy wars, economic warfare, cyber operations, and infrastructure sabotage rather than direct military occupation. What this means for the next 10 years is something that no mainstream institution wants to say clearly. So let's say it here. The transition from the dollar-based unipolar order to whatever comes next will not be clean. It will not be peaceful in every dimension. But the form of conflict is changing. The Stimson Center analysis suggests that the incentive structure for large-scale territorial war among great powers is actually decreasing, not because the world is becoming more moral, but because the costs of open great power conflict have become existential for everyone involved, including the financial interests that fund governments. What is increasing is economic warfare, technological competition, and the fight over who controls digital financial infrastructure. The world is not entering a new age of peace. It is entering a new age of conflict by other means. The battlefield has moved from land and sea to balance sheets, blockchain networks, semiconductor supply chains, and undersea internet cables. The weapons are sanctions, export controls, currency manipulation, and algorithmic trading systems. And the casualties in this war are currencies, industries, and the middle classes of countries that fail to adapt fast enough. America is losing not because it was defeated in battle. America is losing because it hollowed itself out over 40 years to maximize short-term corporate profits, accumulated debt that now constrains every policy option, allowed its industrial base to be transferred to a strategic competitor, and built a financial system so complex and leverage-dependent that it cannot be reformed without causing the crisis it was designed to prevent. The country that invented the modern world is now watching the world it invented being rebuilt without it at the center. The question is not whether this transition happens. It is already happening. The question is how disruptive the transition will be and who emerges from it with real power. The asset managers are betting on tokenized digital infrastructure. The sovereign leaders are betting on resource control and regional dominance. The technocrats are betting on whoever funds the next generation of AI. And ordinary people, in America, in Europe, in every country that built its economic model on the assumption that the dollar-led order was permanent, are going to pay for a transition they had no voice in designing. The mechanism has been set in motion. The old world order that ran on petrodollars, military enforcement, and the fiction of endless American supremacy is not coming back. The new order being assembled in Davos boardrooms, Beijing policy committees, and blockchain developer conferences is not going to ask for your approval before it arrives. The only real question left, the one nobody at Davos answered, because nobody knows the answer, is whether the people who are losing power will accept that loss quietly or whether they will do something dangerous on the way down. That is where we are, in March 2026. Not at the end, at the most dangerous moment of the transition.